The Biden administration says it is working to find shelter for thousands of unaccompanied children who showed up at the U.S. border in the last few weeks. Right now, about 19,000 children are in government custody. That shatters previous monthly records. Altogether, Customs and Border Protection agents apprehended about 170,000 people along the southern border in March. President Biden recently spoke about what he believes to be the root causes leading to the influx at the U.S. border.
The reason why so many people were leaving, we learned, was that not only gang violence and trafficking cartels, but natural disasters, hurricanes, floods, earthquakes.
For more on this, I want to bring in Kevin Sieff. He is a Latin America correspondent at The Washington Post. Kevin, let's get right into the details of the unaccompanied minors processed by immigration agents this year. More are from Guatemala than any other country. You have spent time in the region. Why are so many people trying to leave, Guatemala in particular?
Yeah, I mean, there's no single reason why so many Guatemalans, especially Guatemalan minors, are coming to the U.S. border. But there is one, I think, very important factor that isn't really getting enough attention, which is there is an enormous hunger crisis in Guatemala, which has gotten a lot worse over the last year. Guatemala is now has the sixth highest chronic malnutrition rate in the world, and the acute malnutrition rate among children has doubled in the last 12 months. And so one of the reasons why there are so many people coming, so many Guatemalans coming to the U.S. border, is that it's very difficult, increasingly difficult, to have enough food on the table to feed your family. And so you've got children, you have adults, you have entire families coming to the U.S., in part because they've just sort of, come to a point where in their villages, in their communities, it's too hard to find food.
I just want to underscore what you said there, Kevin, that acute malnutrition of children actually doubled in just the last month. More than 400,000 people in Guatemala are facing food insecurity. How much is the international community actually stepping in, independent of what's happening at the U.S. southern border, on what is clearly a humanitarian crisis?
The international community for years has had some presence in Guatemala, specifically aiming at improving food security. But I think what the numbers that you just mentioned tell us is that the international presence, along with what the Guatemalan government itself is doing, isn't enough to provide food security for hundreds of thousands of Guatemalans. This year, in 2021, the World Food Program expects that about 500,000 people will be in emergency conditions with regards to food security, which is just one level below famine. Which, to have that in a country that is not currently at war is incredibly uncommon, to say the least. Not only that, Guatemala has the largest GDP in Central America. So we're not talking about a country that's as poor as South Sudan, as Yemen, as Afghanistan, other countries that suffer from enormous food insecurity problems. This is a country where food insecurity is a product of enormous inequality, poor governance, the marginalization of indigenous communities. And that's the reason why predominantly we're talking about indigenous families that are unable to get enough food on the table. In indigenous communities in northern Guatemala, the chronic malnutrition rate is 70%, which is higher than any other country in the world. So we're talking about numbers that are really unheard of in across the rest of Central America, but really across the rest of the world, including countries that are currently at war.
Kevin, those statistics are staggering. Let's bring this back now to the U.S. southern border. Might international aid from the U.S. government and others mitigate that situation, that massive influx, particularly of these unaccompanied minors?
Yeah, I mean, the Biden administration is now discussing a $4 billion aid plan for Central America, which would inevitably include some programs aimed at food security in Guatemala for the reasons that we mentioned. Part of the problem is that aid only does so much to provide food security, right? I mean, ultimately, the idea is that these families in Guatemala will have food crops that they can grow themselves, that will have a sort of food supply chain within Guatemala that will allow them to eat, 3 meals a day. rather than just depending entirely on international donations. But because of the effect of climate change, for example, which has destroyed harvests across Guatemala, because of the hurricanes that hit Guatemala last year, because of historic droughts in Guatemala, all of those reasons, it's very difficult to have a reliable source of food. So, historically, these were communities that could depend on regular harvest, could depend on harvest not only as a source of employment, but as a source of their own food. That no longer is the case because of the effects of climate change. And so one of the things the international community will try to do, is improve farming practices or change farming practices in Guatemala so that they can be adapted to places that have been affected by climate change. The question is, how much can you adapt those farming practices? How much can you adapt food supply chains in Guatemala in the midst of this what appears to be, sort of the rapid effects of climate change, so that people can eat enough? It's unclear how that will happen.
Well, and Kevin, as you're talking about changing farming practices, particularly to account for climate change, I wonder about the people who are already at the border. Is there a short-term solution?
I mean, for the people who've already arrived at the border, I guess what I would say is, like, I was in Guatemala last week, but a few weeks before that, I was on the border. And so I interviewed Guatemalan families in Guatemala who were preparing to leave for the US, but I also interviewed families from Guatemala who had already arrived at the border. And one of the things that struck me the most interviewing families on the border was that they had crossed into the US for exactly the reasons we're describing. These acute malnutrition, the inability to find jobs, the inability to find food sources. But instead, in many cases, instead of being allowed into the US to begin their asylum applications, they were sent into northern Mexico, where they were waiting on the streets, and that's where I interviewed them. And so you have people who fled acute food crises in Guatemala and are sent back to northern Mexico without any food supply there either, but not only that, to a remarkably dangerous part of Mexico. And so I don't necessarily know I don't think there's a short-term solution to the situation we're seeing at the border, but certainly the way that families are being expelled to Mexico without anything feels like it's only exacerbating an already difficult situation.
Just heartbreaking. Kevin Sieff, thank you.
Thank you.